Welcome to Political Underdevelopment. Let me first give you a summary of what I mean by that phrase. The central idea that I'm going to put to you here is that what we call bad government in the poorer countries of the global south is to some extent the result of the fact that poorer countries in the global south share a world with richer and more powerful countries. And they interact with those richer and more powerful countries, and that causes political problems. Before we go into detail on that, I just want to look at some very simplified facts. And the facts are that, as far as we can tell, in the long-term perspective of several centuries, the degree of income inequality between the richest and the poorest countries in the world has been increasing relatively steadily. And even over the last 200 years, you'll see the estimate is an increase from 3 to 1 to 20 to 1 in favor of rich countries. Now, some of you might say, but isn't that all changing with the growth of China, etc.? Well, what we know is that from about 1995, there was some leveling up, especially because of economic growth in China, India, other parts of Asia. It's not clear that leveling up will continue for all countries, and one of the results of COVID seems to be that poorer countries, not China, not India, are again fading away in terms of economic growth. So perhaps the best guess at this moment is that some countries, including China, will probably leap from poverty to wealth, as did Korea, South Korea and Taiwan before them a few decades ago, but we're probably not going to see any overall convergence in the world between richer and poorer countries. So that's the context of increasing inequality. And the question about the impact of that is summarized very simply here, and I emphasize simply, in two different images. If rich countries and poor countries inhabit the world at the same time, does the existence of richer countries make it easier for poorer countries to grow, or has no impact at all, or actually has a negative effect? So there are three possibilities. Here the images are two. One is the one on your left, which is just that countries happen to grow and develop and become rich, whichever term you want to use, at different rates at different times. And eventually all these trees will grow up to be about the same height. So it just so happens that some countries lag. The complete opposite view on this is the idea that when some countries get ahead, they actually positively make it more difficult for weaker, poorer countries who are behind them to catch up. So their progress is suppressed by the richer countries. Now, this is a pretty old idea in development studies. When I first came into the development studies business, I was introduced to this idea in terms of a dichotomy between what were two prevalent ideas about development at the time. This is the 1960s, by the way. And the more common idea at that point was what I call the laggard theory just now. Some poor countries happen to have been left behind, so they could catch up and be helped by the leaders to catch up. That summarized a great deal of what was called modernization theory at the time, but also then, and indeed today, an awful lot of development and aid policy. The opposite view was really first articulated very clearly in the 1960s by a group of people who were known as dependency theorists, which was the idea that the wealth and progress of some countries was going to result in the underdevelopment of the others. The phrase "the development of underdevelopment" from Andre Gunder Frank in 1966 was actually encapsulates this very neatly. Underdevelopment is not, an original condition. It's something that is caused by someone else. So there was a whole school of thought, dependency theory. I'm going to come back to that at the end, which said, yes, poor countries are poor because of their relation with the rich countries. Dependency theory was sort of broadly Marxist, particularly in the sense that it didn't distinguish really between economic and political processes. Underdevelopment was simultaneously economic and political, and it was really quite weak on, specific propositions, exactly what is going on here and how can we know that this is actually what's going on. It was more, an attitude, if you want, than a specific set of propositions. And not actually a bad attitude either. And again, I'll come back to that at the end. So that's underdevelopment generally. But in this lecture, I'm going to focus more. No, actually, before we come to that, let's just go back to the colonial era that was kind of important. And colonialists did tend to have theories about why they were able to colonize poorer parts of the world and why poorer parts of the world needed their civilizing mission. The most common arguments were either some idea of cultural inferiority or superiority, which we don't need to discuss any further, or ideas about climate, and somehow countries of the global south were dominantly, in the tropics and subtropics, and climates and humidity, etc., made people lazy. Now, none of those arguments in the original form should be dignified with any respect. But the idea that biology, not biology of humans, but the kind of biology of the world and vegetation and climate and all those things contributed cannot be dismissed. There is a very interesting book, now 20 years old, by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs and Steel, that provides, in my mind, a very significant beginning to explaining why some countries became rich and wealthy and other countries didn't. And that focuses in particular on the notion that across Eurasia, there were large, it was easy to move east and west, and a lot of technology moved very easily east and west. So Eurasia in general was early on the most developed part of the world. There were particular problems in other parts of the world, notably in sub-Saharan Africa, where the prevalent diseases, including tsetse fly, made it impossible for people to use large animals for draft, for ploughing fields, and restricted the extent to which agriculture should develop, etc. So that's a good start. If we add to that the kind of whole, what you might call the colonial episode, but the military and demographic expansion of Northwest Europe into the rest of the world from around the 16th century, and then we add some of the underdevelopment perspectives that I've talked of before, I think we have at least the bones of a reasonable explanation. But I'm not going to go into that explanation today, and if people want to explore this further, Jared Diamond's book is really a pretty good place to start. So in this class, I want to focus much more specifically on political differences between richer and poorer countries. And I'm going to try to explain why poorer countries on average are worse governed than rich countries. Now, some of you hopefully will immediately say, but is that true? Are you sure it's true? And you're right to ask that. because there are all kinds of biases in the way that we think about the world, which would encourage people in the global north like me to believe that, even if it weren't true. And certainly we should be more skeptical of that general proposition now than 5 years ago, when there have been, in the recent years, and most notably in the Trump presidency, the quality of governance in many northern countries did undertake a significant dip, and to some extent might still be there. So we should not accept the overall proposition too eagerly, but I still believe that if you use criteria like the amount of violence in politics, the degree of stability and predictability in governance and policy, the degree of responsiveness of governments to citizens, the capacity of governments, the rule of law, you will find that there are significant differences between North and South, but of course many other differences as well. This is not a simple difference between North and South. But I'm going to focus on explaining that simple difference just because the whole picture is far too complicated to go into details in one lecture. So there are many potential explanations of this, and I've already looked at the colonial ones. I'm now going to look at another set of 4 that I'm going to call older or traditional explanations. And I'm going to distinguish them from another set, that newer explanations that we're going to come to in a minute. So here are 4 older or more traditional explanations. And the most common, of course, is colonialism itself. Colonial rule obviously generated some really significant problems of governance, including, and here are 3, the creation of artificial boundaries in some parts of the world so that people of the same ethnic and language groups were divided on different sides of national boundaries, the creation of conquest societies that were dominated by small groups of people, very clear throughout most of Latin America, very clear in South Africa, for example, where the pattern of colonial dominance to varying degrees continues today in terms of which kind of ethnic, language, colour groups actually rule societies. Thirdly, excessively powerful central states tended to follow along from colonialism, not always, but very commonly, insufficient devolution of power to subnational governments. And finally, and in some cases, not in others, and this is mainly almost entirely African countries, a very abrupt independence without much preparation that made it quite difficult to rule the newly independent countries. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about colonialism in the next slide, but let's just accept for the moment that, a history of colonialism, all else being equal, is not good news for governments. Another argument is that after the creation of the United Nations in 1940s, the world has become soft, quote unquote, on governments that claim to rule countries but don't actually rule them. The broad idea is this, that before the UN, in terms of what used to be called the Westphalia Principles, governments in the world were recognized by other governments, provided that they could show that they actually controlled population and territory. So anyone who sat in London and could clearly show that they controlled the British Isles or part of the British Isles, and the population was recognized by the rest of the world as being the government of the British Isles. It's argued that what the United Nations effectively did was remove that key test of statehood, and governments were still recognized as being governments, even if they didn't actually control much of their territory and much of their population. And that obviously leads to problems because governments can get away with not ruling effectively and not providing services, etc., because they're recognized by the UN, because they get a certain amount of aid, because there's all kinds of benefits to being recognized by the international system. So I gave you the reference in this, Jackson and Rosberg, and they make a distinction between what they call de facto and de jure states. De facto means states that actually rule, and de jure means those that legally rule. In other words, they are recognized by the international system as ruling, but they don't necessarily actually rule. So this is an explanation about the post-World War II world. I think it probably has some truth. I don't think it's powerful enough to explain everything, but it probably has a bit of truth. Another argument, much in the same kind of territory, and certainly a stronger argument, is that at various points in history, and especially in the poorer countries of the global south, particular governments have been propped up by aid, military intervention, all kinds of other support by some of the great powers of the world as part of geopolitical conflict. And there's a famous phrase used in this that I think was originally used in relation to some very nasty dictator in Central America. And someone said to some senior American political figure, you know, we're supporting that guy, but he's a son of a bitch. To which the answer was, yes, we know he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So that phrase is just used for the idea that external agents support often quite nasty governments and keep them in power even when their own citizens would never consent to supporting them. That was clearly a very significant issue in parts of the world during the Cold War. And there it was pretty much a binary issue. You're either on the side of the Americans in the West or you're on the side of the Russians. And some countries slipped from one to the other. And the classic case, often cited this, is Somalia, which before about 1990 and the collapse of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Somalia had actually been supported at one time by the Soviets and at another time by the West. But the government had been propped up by foreign aid and foreign military aid. When those sources of revenue disappeared, the political order in Somalia just imploded very quickly. And Somalia has been without an effective central government ever since. So that's an extreme case, but there are other similar cases. Now, this phenomenon has not disappeared today. There are still sons of bitches, but the difference is that the external powers who support their own particular sons of bitches are much larger in number. So if you look at countries like Libya, Syria, Yemen today, and the Middle East is particularly rich in these kinds of countries, you have either nasty or non-existent governments or contested governments, often in conflict, that are normally two, sometimes three, supported by odd combinations, and I can't actually remember who is on whose side when, but, you know, apart from the West and maybe France operating separately and maybe Britain separately, you have United Arab Emirates as a major player here, you have Saudi Arabia as a major player, you have Turkey as a major player, sometimes Qatar as a major player. So the phenomenon is still there, but it is much more complicated. And Libya, for example, now has a sort of de facto truce between two main competing centres of power, but those two centres of power were for the last 3 or 4 years each supported by different combinations of those countries I've just mentioned. The fourth traditional explanation is actually of a very different order, and that is just the argument that poverty itself, low incomes, actually tends to result in political problems because it generates an excessive interest in the capture of state power in order to make money and livelihoods and wealth, etc. I think there's probably some truth in this. And it's probably true in particular because of the prevalence of unemployment, especially youth unemployment in many low-income countries. So the broad argument would be that in happy situations where you have a thriving economy, most people who are ambitious and want to do well in the world, especially want to do well materially, will go into business and enterprise and make money that way. But if your economy is fairly poor and there are not that many opportunities, more people will see the possibility of capturing political power and using political power to generate material wealth of various kinds, which it does fairly reliably. And they're particularly likely to do that if there are a lot of unemployed young people around who can be recruited for fairly small sums of money into political parties and movements and militias and everything else. So in a context today where we have a lot of youth unemployment, there is probably some truth in the idea that poverty itself generates a degree of bad government because it generates too much political competition for power. And when people have power, they're reluctant to give it up. And to that extent, you might say that higher incomes will help to solve this problem. But I don't think that is the dominant explanation. And there are plenty of others that are important. And I'm going to move into those others in a minute, but before that, I am going to look a little bit more about colonial rule and the impacts on government. Again, this is a quick taster. There's a lot that could be said about this. But the central point here is that actual colonial experiences were very different across different parts of the global south, and we need to be beware of kind of simplistic views that colonialism led to one result rather than another result. Now, what I've done here is present some sort of average or typical scenarios for 3 different parts of the world and looked at a range of variables down the one side. I don't think I'm going to go into detail on this at this moment. Very happy to discuss it later in the later lecture continuation session or in any other mode if you wish. But it's quite useful in particular to point out the difference between sub-Saharan Africa and the other 2 regions. In essence, in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm taking South Africa out of sub-Saharan Africa here because for these purposes, South Africa is actually much more like Latin America. For most of sub-Saharan Africa, you start off with a long history of the slave trade before colonialism. But colonialism came to most of sub-Saharan Africa fairly late. Large regions of sub-Saharan Africa were not effectively occupied by European colonial powers until around 1900. But when they were occupied fast because the colonial powers had military superiority of a very high degree, including early versions of machine guns. Fighting against people who often had the most, low efficiency muskets and not even modern rifles. So colonial conquest came late, but it came fast. When it was imposed very heavily with colonial bureaucrats, nearly all of them career bureaucrats from Britain, France or Spain going back home, ruling via local intermediaries of various kinds, call them appointed chiefs if you want, and often ruling territories which had actually been drawn out in Berlin by European powers in around 1882, territories that did not correspond at all closely to natural features. So you had political systems that were, if you like, thrown together very quickly and actually not ruled by colonial powers very long. If you say 1960 is the sort of typical date of independence, 1960 to 1965, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa were colonized for sort of 70, 80 years, less than a century. And added to that, the extent of education of African populations and, preparation for there to occupy senior positions in government was minimal and often came very late, because the decolonization in sub-Saharan Africa actually came very fast, really. It wasn't that much expected 10 years before, and then the momentum got up, and so independence was declared quickly. And the classic case, the worst case here is probably the Belgian Congo, where I think I'm right in saying there were allegedly only 2 Africans who had university degrees at the point of independence. So that's sub-Saharan Africa, which had a particularly bad experience on top of the slave trade, had a particularly bad experience of colonization, and particularly bad from the point of view of constructing effective states. The experiences of Latin America or South and Southeast Asia are different. I won't go into them here, but let's say there were 2 very common features. One is that they were colonized for longer, and that the political units in which they were divided had longer and longer to kind of develop and separate from each other, did not feel so artificial. And to a much greater extent than sub-Saharan Africa, they were ruled by powerful local intermediaries from resident populations. So, the British colonial Raj in India was ruled almost entirely by Indians. There were a tiny number of white Brits at the top. And those intermediaries, they did very well for themselves out of colonial ruling on behalf of the Brits. Similarly, in Latin America, the early settlers, the early white settlers settled. Some remained fairly white. In some other cases, there was a great deal of intermixing with the local population, the creation of what were called mestizo, mixed race, quote unquote, elites. But these locally resident populations were very powerful. So significantly different experience. Now, I want to shift on to what is in that is mostly context. I'm going to shift in a minute to what I think is the most important part of this lecture, which is the new sources of bad governance in the global south that have emerged broadly since around 1970, and what I'm calling the globalization era. And there are 5 of them. They're listed here: resource curse, international drug trade, illicit financial flows, elite dependence on overseas institutions, and changing military technology. Now, I give you a sort of odd apology here. The main reading I gave you on this was an article by me, which was an article I wrote a long time ago. I'm not entirely happy with that article. I think it could be better. I think it could be updated. I give it to you not out of egoism, but because I don't know any other single, not even a book actually, but certainly not an article, which puts forward in a kind of neat form this broad argument that since 1970 there are new sources of political underdevelopment. So that's why I gave it to you, not because it's great, but because it's all I have. So we can now take a break if you like and absorb that. I will carry on talking here, and I'm going to take each of those 5 points I made above in sequence. And the first one, this is simple replication of what we talked about in the class on tax and the resource curse 2 weeks ago. I've replicated some of the main arguments here on the slide. I'm not going to go through them, but let's remember the important things are that these very large rents from natural resource extraction mostly date from the period after the 1970s. It was particularly two big increases in the global oil price in the 1970s that made rents from the extractive sector from small up to big. So this is post 1970s. And the second point is that these rents are very large in poor economies in a way that they would not be in rich and more industrialized economies. Imagine you had an extractive business, can be oil, gas, minerals, whatever. Let's say it's producing $1 billion a year. And let's say, let's go high, 50% of that, $500 million a year on average is rent. Well, if you put $500 million of rent into the economy of France, or even Denmark, or Germany, or Canada, certainly not the United States, $500 million, it's very small. Quite hard to see, actually, in the macro statistics. If you put $500 million into the economy of, let's say, Congo, Brazzaville, or Uganda, or Paraguay, or many other smaller and poorer countries in the south, it is big, and that is a very important feature of the resource curse and why it impacts so much and adversely in countries of the global south. So that is the resource curse, which you now know about very well. The second issue we're looking is at the international drug trade. Okay, so the illegality of the international drug trade dates back to the 1950s and the 1960s, when rich countries, especially the United States, for reasons that I'm not entirely clear, decided that the consumption of various kinds of drugs by their populations, that was not that unusual and certainly wasn't new, was a very bad thing. And they were going to stop it. And they were going to make drug consumption and the drug trade illegal. And at that point, most of the consumption of drugs was in rich countries because people in rich countries could afford it. Well, you make a product illegal. At the same time, from the 1960s onwards, international trade and communications became cheaper and cheaper. People started traveling more and more by airlines, ships became faster, the container business started to develop very fast, the volume of world trade started to develop very fast. So the mechanisms you could use to get illicit drugs from poor countries to rich countries suddenly became, much more elaborate. There's just much more trade in which you can smuggle this stuff. And, international communications are much easier. Everything made it easier. So poorer countries, not having that many alternatives, began to see that they had some really major business opportunities, or some people in poorer countries. So they had major business opportunities in rich countries. These were particularly from Central and Latin America, from Afghanistan, and from Southeast Asia. And there was a little bit of smuggling of cannabis, but not that much. And we were talking at this point of almost entirely of the derivatives of either coca or of opium. The drug business developed fast, and it was dominantly serving rich country consumers. But because it was illegal and to some extent policed, most of the profits from the drug business did not go to the people who produced the drugs. You couldn't just produce coca and then, sell it through the legal market to consumers somewhere in the United States. It had to go through illicit trades. And so the illicit drug traders are the people who cream off the great bulk of the profit from the international drug trade. And of course, they share it with some people. And the people they share it with in particular are people in power in governments, in policing, in immigration, etc. So what happens in effect is that the drug trade starts to seriously corrupt and to control parts of government, both in the producing countries and in the trans-shipping countries. And of course there's competition for this because it's a lot of money. And this just generates a great deal of violence. The story of Mexico over the last 3 or 4 decades is, to a very significant degree, the story of drug violence and the infiltration of drugs into politics and attempts by some politicians to deal with this. It is an awful mess, but it's not only Mexico. Mexico is mainly a transshipment point, to some extent a producing country. Other producing countries have been, Colombia at one point, Peru, etc. Transshipment countries are often affected. The tiny country of Guinea-Bissau in West Africa became at one point a major transshipment center of drugs from Latin America to Europe, and you get the same corruption of politics there as a result of the drug trade that you get in Mexico. So the drug trade was a problem, but it was a problem principally because it was illegal. And who made it illegal? Rich countries did. So there are a few other things we could mention about the trend. The problem is still there. It is changing shape to some extent. Several things are happening. Cannabis is no longer, I think, traded illegally internationally, except maybe a tiny bit from Morocco, because cannabis is much more efficiently grown inside these days in hydroponics, and so is grown mainly in the countries where it is consumed. Cannabis has been, anyway, to some extent, decriminalized in quite a lot of richer countries and probably in many more now. To a much less extent, derivatives of like heroin and cocaine have been decriminalized, so they're still largely criminalized and very large profits are made from them. Another thing that's happening in the trade is various synthetic drugs are now emerging, and they are made pretty much all over the world, sometimes in rich countries where they're consumed, sometimes in poor countries. And on the whole, in poorer countries, the consumption of heroin, opium, and synthetics tends to be increasing. So, the trade is changing, but it has not changed radically in any major way. It's not clear that it's going to change soon. And, my best guess personally is that it's going to continue to corrupt and poison politics in a number, or quite a number, of lower income countries. The third thing we're looking at is what's called illicit financial flows. Very big subject. I'm just going to do the bare outlines of this. There was one reading I gave you, which is the so-called Mbeki report from the African Union, UNECA, dated 2014, I think. But there is masses about this on the internet. It's a very big topic. And in my humble view, this is a central issue in development and development policy today, in a way that I'll explain a bit later. So basically, illicit financial flows are money that's moved between countries and or kept overseas illegally. The amounts are enormous, and the historical context of this is very important. Until the 1960s in much of the North, but the 1970s or later, the world had what's called exchange control following World War II. And exchange control basically meant that if anyone wanted to sell their domestic currency and exchange it for foreign exchange, dollars or whatever else, they had to go through their central bank and they had to get permission. And so the central bank would give them permission if this was a legitimate trade. But if this was either for investment overseas, for example, it might have been refused. And from the 1960s onwards, this was liberalized and liberalized until there were very few significant foreign exchange controls in the world. And the amount of foreign exchange that's traded in the world is now a massive multiple of what it was in 1970s relative to the amount needed for trade. In other words, if you go back to the 1970s, most of the foreign exchange traded was because of trade, people buying things here and selling them there. Today, the amount of foreign exchange traded in any day in international markets is mostly for investment and speculative and hedging purposes. Very little is to finance trade. So international finance has mushroomed. It's become enormous. And that is an important part of the context of how it's possible for powerful people in poorer countries who obtain money illicitly to send that money abroad and hide it. They can send it abroad and hide it through, several related mechanisms. Basically what you need, in the first place, you need banks that are trustworthy in the sense that they won't steal your money, but also not trustworthy from the public point of view in the sense that they will not reveal that they are dealing with your stolen money. You need banks just to transfer your money from one country to the other. And banks, international banks, do this all the time, and they keep getting investigated and they keep getting fined and they keep saying they've cleared up, and then they do it again and again and again. So it's become part of the global system. And then you need ways of hiding your assets once you've got them somewhere else. Well, there are lots of ways of doing that, including so-called shell companies, which are companies that have no apparently traceable owner. There are no very clear business registers, and also an Anglo-Saxon legal phenomenon called a trust that we needn't go into here. The key point is banks get your money somewhere else in the world. When your money's somewhere else, it's not at all difficult to find ways of hiding it. And there is a massive business in the world of people who will help you do this. They're bankers and lawyers and accountants and advisors of all kinds. The biggest single concentration is about 40 miles from here in London, but you'll find them in so many other parts of the world. And it also helps slightly that many other parts of the world now have what they call golden passports, which is effectively, if you're a citizen of any country in the world and you come along to certain other countries, like maybe Cyprus, maybe Portugal these days, say, I would like to become a citizen of your country. And the answer is yes, you can become a citizen of your country as long as you bring so much capital into our country. Governments are selling passports, in other words. So how does this impact? Well, imagine you're a politician in any low-income country. You might be an average person, you're tempted to do bad, but you sometimes know it's bad. Well, if we go back to before 1970 and you were a politician in a poor country, if you were tempted to do bad and steal a lot of money through corruption or some other similar source, it was kind of nice, you had a lot of money, but it was quite hard to get it out of the country. It certainly wasn't easy. You probably keep a lot of it in the country. If you want to get it out of the country, you actually probably had to literally smuggle dollar notes in suitcases or buy diamonds and resell them. So it could be done, but it was a bit challenging and something might go wrong. If someone interrupts your suitcase full of diamonds, you just lose it. But today, and for the last few decades, you haven't had to worry about that, because as long as you can get reasonable advice from someone, they can tell you how to get the money out there and how to hide it once it gets there. I mean, you may be unlucky, you may end up with getting named in all the Panama and other papers that have been revealed by wonderful investigative journalists, but the chances of that happening are very small. So, and we don't know this, but it seems to me highly likely, to put it no more than that, that this results in a much stronger temptation to corruption now than, say 1960, for powerful people, because they can get the money out. And of course, in addition to that, it's much easier these days to get their children educated overseas in London or Sussex or wherever. They can buy properties overseas, they can buy golden passports. And if the worst comes to the worst, if they actually lose power, there's a coup or an election or whatever, well, actually they can just either jump in their helicopter or go to the airport and they can get out. And, they might miss their home country, but, they have enough money squirreled away to keep them and their descendants in great luxury for a very long period of time. So, to put it at its mildest, it's hard to believe that the possibility of illicit international flows is not an incentive to corruption. The fourth point is kind of related: elite dependence on overseas institutions, and it really follows from the previous point. So you're a corrupt and very wealthy person from any lower income country that you care to name. You got lots of money. The one thing you do need to keep your money is banks that are reliable and not going to steal your money. You need stock exchanges that are reliable and you're not going to lose your money through, manipulation of stock exchanges by people who control from the inside. You need business and property registries that are reliable and uncorruptible, so that when you register a business in the name of someone else to disguise the fact that it's you, then that someone else, or indeed some other someone else, is not going to claim that the property is actually theirs. You need reliable insurance markets and bond markets and all the periphery of modern financial capitalism. You need reliable legal systems, so you need reliable courts. So, here's a paradox. Once you've stolen the money, you've got it somewhere else. You need lots and lots of honest, reliable institutions to make sure you can keep it. You need to make sure that your accountant is not going to cheat you. You want to be sure that the police are not going to discover your money and, shake you down. So, you're sitting in a poor country and you're making lots of money and you need these systems. Well, what do? You could, of course, create them in your own country, which is hard work, but it's also not the optimal thing you really want to do, because you'd actually, on the whole, don't want to keep most of this money in your own country. Because if you keep it in your own country and there's a change in political power and you are now out and the new government is investigating your assets, etc., you want all your assets to be out of their reach somewhere else. So you have limited incentives anyway to develop these things in your own country. On the other side, you actually want them in London. Now, I'm putting London in quotations, but it is also London in reality, but not entirely London. That is to say, you will need international financial centres that will provide you with all these good things, and ideally with great places to live, with lots of culture and theatre and other rich people to hobnob with and everything else. So the incentives to establish these kinds of institutions in your own country are relatively weaker if they are already in existence elsewhere, and all those institutions elsewhere are actually quite welcoming and say, yes, come, we can do everything for you. For example, to give a non-trivial example, if you're very wealthy, and you're having a divorce, which will involve disputes about lots and lots of money, you can effectively choose to have your divorce hearings in London, almost independently of where you come from or where you live or where your money is. So there is a sense in which the sophistication of these financial institutions in London and elsewhere actually directly discourages their creation elsewhere in the world. Now, this is very strongly evident in the relationship between Russia and literally London in particular. And not only Russia, the other sort of countries of the former Soviet Union. And that is I gave you a reading about this, and that I think tells the story very well. It's obviously a big issue and a sort of slightly messy issue. We're not really sure what the effect on incentives are, but it seems very clear, at least in principle. And we should, of course, add that all this is much easier in the age of globalization, where international travel is so much easier than it was, and your children can go abroad, they can do their degrees in London, they can buy their flats in London, they can keep coming back home very conveniently as long as it's safe to do so, but stop doing so if the political climate back home gets bad, etc. So my final point is about changing military technology. And I don't think I dealt very well with that in the article on political underdevelopment that I gave you. So I just want to summarize here the essence of it. Let's go back in history until the 1860s, no further than that. And after that, for more than a century, interstate wars, and there were lots of them, and in fact a lot of civil wars as well, in fact many civil wars, basically involved what we called mass mobilization. That meant that significant fractions of the male population were recruited into militaries. Now, that was possible because of changing technology. First of all, railways that could move men and supplies around, and then petrol and diesel engines, but also the industrial manufacture of standard weapons, etc. And that mass mobilization during large-scale wars didn't stop at men fighting. It also included women being recruited into the business of producing armaments and, steel and chemicals and all those other things. Now, that mass mobilization war made for some pretty bloody wars, and it also tended to exacerbate nationalisms very clearly within Europe. But it did have actually a rather positive side. And its positive side meant that any government that was going to be prepared to fight a war basically needed to keep its own working class on side. Because if it didn't keep its working class on side, its working class wouldn't be willing to fight very eagerly for it during a war. And that meant, in effect, large-scale institutionalized social spending, starting with, for example, old age pensions and then gradually expanding. And you can see the origins of what we call in Britain the welfare state in military rivalry between Germany and Britain around 1900, just before and just after. And so governments needed their working class to be substantially loyal and substantially healthy and well fed, and they fed them a diet of good food and a lot of nationalism. But in recent decades, the basic technology of warfare is changed. To win wars these days, you no longer need very large mass mobilization armies and recruit large proportions of your working class and recruit large numbers of women in wartime to produce munitions. Military technology is gradually, and it's because this is an increasing trend, it's becoming more electronic, more digital, more focused on surveillance and data, and smarter in the language of Silicon Valley. And what that means in practice is that military power no longer depends on mobilizing a lot of people, but it means that you need much smaller numbers of much higher trained military specialists, and you need a lot of the right kind of hardware and software, and it means money. But once you have that money, you don't necessarily have to recruit much of your military from your own people. You can buy your military, not only your military technology abroad, but you can buy the people who operate it. And what's effectively happened in the world in the last few decades is that the age of the mercenary, that warfare is basically fought by mercenary, people who are paid job, which was the norm in Europe until about 200 years ago. The age of the mercenary has, to a large extent, reappeared, and it's especially reappeared in Africa. Much less extent in Asia, by the way, for reasons I don't fully understand. Many countries in Asia, the whole of South Asia, Vietnam, still have very big militaries, but it's partly in South Asia because they're facing off against each other. But not true in Africa. There are very few large military forces, and there is an increasing dependence on mercenaries. So if you're a government and you already have money from some other source, like oil or gas or minerals, etc., you can protect that by hiring in the military forces you need, provided you can support them. And so, some of the nastiest political and military conflicts going on in Africa today, and there's still quite a few at a low level. They're not killing thousands every day, but they're killing quite a lot. Quite a few of them involve mercenary forces. So I gave you a reading that relates to a group of Israeli companies who've been provided military services to a particularly nasty unit in the Cameroon. That's basically the sort of the personal army of the President Paul Biya. President Biya has been president of Cameroon for 39 years, which is quite a long time. He has oil. That's all it needs to tell you. Oil, mercenaries, long rule. But that's not the only case. There are a wide variety of mercenaries. Some of you will remember during the American occupation of Iraq, the American military employed what they call military service companies, mercenaries on a large scale. If you look at the news today, literally today, if you'll see in the Central African Republic, which is a very, very deeply conflict-affected country, quite recently a very nasty group of Russian mercenaries called the Wagner Group have moved in. They are fighting on behalf of the president, who is he's not a nice man, shall we say. The Wagner Group are terrorizing parts of the local population. They are also taking over oil and diamond producing areas to give themselves a nice source of income. And they are directly linked to the Kremlin. So, but we needn't kind of, mercenaries come from all kinds of countries. It's not one rather than the other. But the general phenomenon of a government that has money and can therefore buy its military support, doesn't need to recruit its military support from its own citizens, is a very important phenomenon of the global south in recent years. So, where does this leave us? Well, the general proposition is what I'm calling state building in low-income countries today is actually impeded significantly by these 5 factors that I've just listed to you. A quick word here on what we mean by state building, because it's often, it's much disputed. Some people, by the way, use the term for state building done from the outside. So they say the Americans in Afghanistan were trying to do state building and that's bad. I'm not talking about state building in that way. I'm talking about state building broadly from within, and it means many things, but it's useful to think of it in terms of, 2 polar different types of state building. The first one is really building up the organizations of government, the organizations and the bureaucracy, making the government apparatus more effective and efficient, training public servants, better human resource management, better oversight and discipline, better anti-corruption, improving organizational IT systems, etc., etc. Broadly strengthening and improving the government apparatus. That is on the whole easier for aid donors to do. It's sort of tangible, something they can focus on, tends to be their first preference. And it's slightly related to the two different concepts of power that I gave you in the first class. The other concept of state building is really much more related to the idea I gave it in my second class about tax and social contracts, which is about the idea that you improve the quality of the interaction and bargaining and interdependence between state and citizens. Slightly intangible, bit hard for aid donors to get deeply involved in. For present purposes, 2 points. One is state building means different things, but I wouldn't say that one of them should have priority over the other. I mean, we need both. The problem is we don't have terribly good ways of, I think, often of doing either of them. So, some concluding comments. I first actually got involved in thinking about the kind of things I've presented to you here probably about 20 years ago. I used to be more actively involved in the British aid programme, the governance element of the British aid programme. And it gradually dawned on me that the focus of the British aid programme on governance, and indeed most other aid donors, was essentially on doing things within low-income countries. The problem was over there, so we would do something there. We try and do something about the government apparatus or accountability over there. But it became evident to me, look, part of the problem, and especially for Britain, which is the centre of this massive financial centre, part of the problem of poor governance in low-income countries is things that happen in London. It's all this corrupt money that's recycled through London, etc. So, I broadly got into this because I tried to make the argument, let's have a more balanced approach to this and, see where we, in a sense, rich countries, are part of the problem here and not just part of the solution, and do something about our own behaviour and the way we interact with the global south or affect incentives in the global south. So that's how I got into the business. I'm not sure that it leads to a particular policy conclusion, but let me conclude rather with a sort of more intellectual point rather than a policy point. There is, in development studies, a kind of third world populism for which the default mode is the idea that kind of rich countries bad, poor countries good. Whenever rich countries do anything that affects poor countries or rich country actors, that has some malign intention behind it, and so rich countries will always tend to dominate poor countries. Now, in its many simplified forms, I think that is problematic from the point of view of kind of accuracy in terms of what goes on in the world. But it is not a bad way of thinking. Let me take you back to the dependency theory that I talked about at the very beginning. And one of the people I cited was a guy called Walter Rodney, who wrote in 1972 a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Quite a long book, actually. Now, this was a very good example of dependency theory manifested in terms of this third world populism. If you go through Walter Rodney's book, almost every paragraph is about how Europe, in this sort of big abstract sense, was always dominating Africa and always had malign intentions and always had very bad effects. So, I and most of you could go through this and you'd say, yeah, but, that's very simplified, and etc. You would go through and say, no, this book is nonsense. Actually, I don't think it is nonsense. And the reason I don't think it's nonsense is that I think it's a very valuable perspective that we in development studies should always bear in mind. And the reason I think is fairly obvious, that development studies, especially if you're doing it in a country like Britain, is always going to have a bias towards the perspectives that are in some sense rooted in the global north, regardless of the identity of the particular person who's giving you the lecture. we're bound to have a bit of a northern bias. And if we have a northern bias, we tend to see things from the northern point of view, and we therefore tend to see other parts of the world as kind of problematic, and we tend to be slightly kind about our own intentions and our own actions. So in putting forward the idea of political underdevelopment, I'm not actually putting forward to you a kind of third world populist idea that the rich North is always underdeveloping, in a political sense, the global South. I'm just saying, to some extent it is. I think there is a lot of useful truth in the kind of perspectives I've presented to you here. The question I haven't answered, in addition to the big unanswered question about the policy implications, is whether there are actually governance benefits to poor countries from sharing a world with all these rich northern countries like this. I personally tend to see the problems rather than the benefits, but I'm not prepared to say that they are entirely problems and there aren't any benefits attached. Anyway, big questions, a lot to discuss, and as you will probably guess, no simple answers to any of this.